بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum. Walk around a little bit. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So happy to be back. So inshallah, I want to get right into our topic. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to teach us that which is beneficial and always benefit us through sacred knowledge. All right, so if volume is good, I'm going to go ahead and continue. So we have for our theme for our last session tonight, Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam. However, I wanted to kind of look at a few aspects of the life of Sayyidina Nuh and kind of connect that to Sayyidina Musa. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala, inshallah, God willing. I think this map is really nice. So I just kind of wanted to give you a bit of that kind of geographical context here in terms of where these stories are taking place. Because understand that we really kind of view, i.e. we meaning within the Islamic tradition, that we understand stories of the prophets as actual human beings that lived in human history. So we're not looking at these stories in terms of sort of emblems or metaphors, although there's certainly a lot of symbolism associated with prophethood, but these are actual historical figures. Now, as I said earlier, can we kind of put a time stamp on the story of Sayyidina Nuh? That's difficult because he lived such a long time ago, obviously. But when it comes to Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam, there's kind of a clearer idea of when he may have existed. Anywhere from around, I've seen different dates, so there's kind of a range, anywhere from around 1800 BCE to around 500 BCE. So again, that's an approximation. Now in terms of where, so you've got in front of you a map of the ancient Middle East, and Sayyidina Nuh, in terms of where the ark ends up landing, again, probably in an area straddling present-day Iraq and Turkey. And as far as the journey of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam, his journey is going to take him from Egypt into Arabia, back to Egypt, back to Arabia, and finally to the Levant, or the area that is known as the Holy Land. Now, as I was thinking about the geography of the lives of the prophets alayhim assalam, I was also thinking about the metaphors. Again, the symbolism is important, this idea of journeying, this idea that their stories are not static. I mentioned earlier that these Quranic narratives of prophecy are a bit open-ended. And we're going to see that in the example of Sayyidina Musa, although, sort of in ukhrawi terms, in terms of how we're thinking about this from the perspective of the next world, although these stories certainly have good endings, you're going to see where there are definitely high points and low points, especially low points, in the story of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam and how he deals with those things. Another thing that I wanted to mention in terms of the geography and this part of the world and why we see so many prophets and messengers in this part of the world, we also have to kind of remind ourselves of this idea of the fadl. We're going to look at this more tomorrow morning. The fadl, this is sort of the bounty, the blessings, the preference, if you will, given to the children of Israel, and the fact that the preponderance of nubuwah, that the majority of prophets are going to be established in that line. Now, of course, that fact does not preclude there having been prophets sent to other communities, other parts of the world. But what we know from the Quran is that the vast majority of these prophets and messengers are primarily going to reside in and live around in the area of the Fertile Crescent. And I think that's very significant when you sort of look at the birthplace, if you will, of the great monotheistic faiths. So I hope this map is helpful here. Now, but there are a couple of things that I felt that I needed to mention, going back to Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam, and that's the idea that he is, according to many accounts, for 900 some years, just really shy of a millennium, engaging in dialogue and da'wah with his people. And just putting ourselves in his shoes for a moment and imagining that sort of place of loneliness and really isolation that he must have inhabited. And, again, the lessons for us, his example is just really replete with lessons for us as minorities. I often, when I teach an Islam in America class at the seminary, where I'm full-time faculty, and one of the things that we do is we like to kind of, we look at the trajectory of the history of Muslims in America, and we kind of look at the African-American experience. And one of the authors we like to read or quote from is W.E.B. Du Bois, who articulated this theory of kind of double consciousness, an experience of being African-American in this land and what it feels to be kind of sort of torn asunder, trying to navigate these kind of multiple and complex identities. So I want us to understand that, again, when we read the stories of prophets and messengers, that there are so many things that we can learn about ourselves, about identity, about dealing with kind of Islamophobia, about existing as a minority. Because, we as Muslims almost sort of experience a bit of a double consciousness in the sense of being both ethnic and racial minorities and religious minorities in this particular religious landscape. And almost sort of, I think, a triple consciousness in the sense that it's not just sort of the dominant religious paradigm of Christianity, but it's really more the secularization of society overall. And I think where Muslims and Christians would definitely have a lot in common is this concern over what postmodernity has wrought, what it's produced. What I mentioned earlier, this idea that's being put forth that there's no universal arbiter of morality, that it is the self that determines what is good, what is bad, what is right and what is wrong, and what is sort of good for society. So when we think about Sayyidina Nuh, he spends, again, centuries working amongst his people, in the end only to find himself the subject of ridicule. And the Quran tells us about some of the language that his people use. For example, in this ayah, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in huwa illa rajulun bihi jinnah, is what they say. This is just a man. So they do this. So his people do this a lot. He's nothing special. He's not an angel. He's just a human being like anyone else. And then on top of that, look at who's following him, is what his people point out. It's the weak. It's the marginalized. According to, this is kind of interesting for people who are worshiping idols, but they actually say, oh, his followers can't really think for themselves. Okay, so he's dealing with, all this sort of vitriol kind of being heaped on him. And then he's building the ark, and again, just imagine that place of kind of loneliness that he has to inhabit, as his people say, in huwa illa rajulun bihi jinnah fatarabbasu bihi hatta hin, that this is not but a man who's possessed with some type of madness, so let's just wait and things will be decided concerning him. Now, with Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam, we also have to pay attention to his response. So again, they're calling him crazy. They're saying his followers are really nobody that you want to pay attention to. They're denying that any aspect of his message could be legitimate. And I want us to think about that, especially when you kind of contrast the experience of both prophets, by the way. So there's almost an outsider-insider perspective here. Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam, as we're going to see in just a moment, is very much that outsider. But I can't think of anyone who has an insider status more than Sayyidina Nuh, in the sense that he is from that community, the people know him, and he spends so much time with them. But despite that fact, they are going to ridicule him. And then he makes this dua, and he actually is asking Allah Ta'ala to not let the disbelievers persist. So his response ultimately is going to be ultimate trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as you can see here in this ayah in front of you. And you kind of think, in terms of the human being, because this prophet is a human being, the emotions that he must be feeling in this moment. The idea that he's trying to present what is a very logical case to his people, that these deities they've taken did not deserve to be deified, because these were human beings. They were righteous human beings, and his people were mistaken in taking these human beings as deities that they then worshipped. So this is the dua that he makes, قَالَ رَبِّ انصُرْنِي. It's very simple, but very profound. بِمَا كَذَّبُونَ. Note what he doesn't say. So he doesn't sort of disparage his people, all right? He could sort of retaliate in kind with all these kind of accusations, again, the name calling, the ridicule, the mockery. There's a lot that we can learn here. Ultimately, the objection of Sayyidina Nuh is really, it's a theological objection. He asks Allah Ta'ala to come to his aid because after all these years, his people are still in that space of denial and calling him a liar. So when we think about Sayyidina Nuh and we think about the other prophets and messengers, I want you to understand that they themselves psychologically have to be stable enough to deal with that discomfort that can come from being a little bit lonely, a little bit isolated, right? Again, in that kind of minority context, even if they're actually not minorities amongst their people. And we think of our experience here as American Muslims and what it means to kind of, sort of swim against the current and how difficult that can be. And those conversations that we have with our children, especially this time of year, I know we get a lot of questions about Christmas and celebrating the holidays and so on. So I want us to make some connections here. And one of the things that I always tell my own children is that it's actually okay to be a little bit uncomfortable with difference, with inhabiting that space that is going to be a little bit lonely sometimes. And now when I say isolation, please understand that I'm not saying this is not isolation in an unhealthy sense, but this is the sort of the resolve that we as believers are going to apply to our status as minorities, right? Not to see ourselves as victims, not to sort of use that, kind of leverage that space as an opportunity to kind of complain or rail against being a minority, but to actually be thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for preserving this religion, for preserving our faith and values, for actually allowing the existence of a community here in America. If you think about how Islam started in this country, it's very different from the spread of Islam, say, in the Levant, in the Middle East, throughout other parts of the world, in that our spiritual forebears, our ancestors, came here literally in chains through the transatlantic, through the Middle Passage, the Atlantic slave trade. So for there to be an established community I think in communities in the Americas, to me, is nothing short of miraculous. So again, when I say to my kids, let's look at it in terms of that discomfort, that there is a certain amount of discomfort kind of inherent in being a believer in this context. Look at the practices, just to give you an example of that. Look at the practices that we embrace. Fasting in the month of Ramadan, when Ramadan's in the summer, to actually kind of willingly accept that we're not going to be eating and drinking for 15, 16 hours a day. That is occupying a space of some discomfort, but it's for a higher and a loftier purpose, because we understand that Allah Ta'ala, that God the Exalted, did not place us here to be in pursuit of kind of fulfilling our own desires, that there's a higher purpose for creation. So that's where the frustration of Sayyidina Nuh with his people comes in. It's not something personal. With prophets and messengers, it's not, when they make these different supplications, when they express these concerns, it's not out of some personal sense of grievance with their people, but out of concern for their people. That again, after 950 years, that he's gotten to this space where he has to build the ark, right? And his people are saying, let's just wait and see what happens to him. Now, a couple more things that I want us to understand about prophets and messengers in the Quran is that they're both fully realized and sort of evolved human beings, but they're also archetypes. And an archetype is really interesting because when you kind of cast someone as an archetype, it means that you, as the individual reader, no matter when you're reading the Quran, no matter where you are, no matter the kind of socio-historical or cultural context, that you can actually kind of read yourself into that narrative. There are elements of that story that will resonate with you, even if the specific details are sort of unique to that prophet or messenger. So I want you to understand that in the Quranic narrative, you really kind of have a balance of certain details that are specific to the prophet or messenger being fleshed out, but the prophet or messenger, that they're also serving as an archetype, so that when you read that story, you understand that you can actually see outlines of your own life in that story. You can read your own struggles into that story. That we're not just treating the Quran as some kind of interesting historical abstraction. We read it, it comes off the shelf when someone gets married or someone passes away, but other than that, we don't open the book. So just to understand this point. And then this idea of contingency versus universality. So when we study the stories of prophets and messengers, do we look at them as being contingent, or do we look at them as sort of moral exemplars? And the reason why I'm highlighting this tension is because we're going to read things about prophets and messengers that from our 21st century vantage point are going to raise some eyebrows. Let's be very honest. Sayyidina Ibrahim is a great example of this, right? He actually has this dream where he's being commanded to sacrifice his son. We think about events in the life of the final prophet and messenger, alayhi salatu wasalam, where we kind of struggle to find answers for certain things, such as, for example, his marriage to Sayyidah Aisha and other issues that might arise for modern day Muslims. So this is why I'm kind of highlighting a tension between the aspects of that kind of prophetic biography that might be more contingent and those aspects that we can kind of universalize. And what I'm going to argue here is that even for episodes, sorry to keep going back and forth, I want to make sure I reach this part of the room. Even for those episodes in the lives of prophet and messengers that we might read as being very idiosyncratic, i.e., this is very kind of specific to that prophet's historical context, you have to understand there's always something that is really kind of supra-historical about that prophet or messenger that we can universalize from. And I think that's very helpful in kind of engaging with some of those more difficult theological questions that arise from studying the lives of prophets and messengers. Obviously, if any one of us has a dream where we're commanded to sacrifice our child, we know not to kind of take stock of that dream. However, when a prophet or messenger has that kind of dream, we need to be able to read it a couple ways. Yes, that particular episode is kind of contingent on the experience of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, but it also necessarily casts Sayyidina Ibrahim as a universal moral exemplar, i.e. the succession of prophets that come afterwards. That succession is not possible without his willingness to sacrifice Sayyidina Ismail, who we know ultimately is miraculously replaced by the ram. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that tension. Now, another point that I wanted to share is, and again, my glasses will probably be helpful at this point, is the sort of connection between ethical choices made by prophets and messengers and their relationship with their devotion to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So again, when we are looking at the story of Sayyidina Nuh or Sayyidina Musa alayhim as-salam, to understand that these are not just kind of interesting decisions that kind of crop up in a prophet or messenger's life, but there's so much that we can kind of read into our own lives on the basis of these decisions. That prophets and messengers, by and large, are not making choices based upon something arbitrary, based upon whim. That there is a level of inspiration that's in operation there. And when they make decisions, when they make choices, that their choices have implications beyond that which is immediately apparent. Their choices actually have implications for how they relate to God and how the people around them are going to relate to Allah the Exalted. Another thing too is to understand and be able to kind of locate these prophets and messengers and their stories as sources of guidance and morality. This final point, I really cannot emphasize this point enough. Because one of the messages that our culture is really kind of driving to us is this idea that a morality can be constituted on the basis of what the nafs, or on the basis of what the self desires. And that it is possible to articulate a moral framework that is completely devoid of God. In fact, there was an interesting article that I read in the New York Times not too long ago that highlighted the chaplain. So this individual is head of chaplaincy at Harvard, which, by the way, started out as a religious school, as many of the private Ivy League schools did. So this individual, again, gets this kind of piece in the New York Times, and they're kind of highlighting his career and his achievements, and he is very explicit about the fact that he is an atheist. All right, let that sink in. The head, chaplaincy by its very nature is what? What is chaplaincy? I'm sorry, it's, yeah, exactly. It's providing religious guidance and pastoral care to those that are under your care. So this is, by its very definition, right, this is kind of a religious space that for people who inhabit that space, they have to have particular qualifications. So this person is an avowed atheist, and he's actually written a book, and it looks like there are some young people in this room, but young people are reading these books, and the book is called Good Without God. And what he's actually articulating is precisely this idea that we don't need to go to religion and prophecy in a divine framework to articulate what is good, what is moral, what is ethical, and what is virtuous. And at least we think, okay, this is kind of interesting, we can kind of sit down and grab a cup of coffee and kind of talk with him about this. I want you to understand that this argument also has extremely dangerous implications for our iman. Because at the very, at the very kind of heart of the jurisprudence of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, at the very heart of mainstream Islam is this idea that it is the lawgiver that is going to, that deems what, the husn and qubh, it's the lawgiver that decides, that deems what is good and what is bad, what is beautiful and what is not, what is appropriate and inappropriate. So if as human beings, we arrogate that power onto ourselves, then we ultimately are stepping into that space of doing what? Of centering the nafs and doing away with that universal moral framework. And this is where prophets and messengers are so important to understand, that their decisions carry moral weight. And that one of the beautiful things about the sending of human beings as prophets and messengers as opposed to angels, because Allah could have sent angels, right? That in the sending of human beings as prophets and messengers, that Allah Ta'ala is actually giving us a sort of an example, a template of what it means to lead a virtuous life in sort of the context of human history. I mean, it's only possible to observe this if you have a living example in front of you. And that's what we are blessed with in terms of prophets and messengers. Now, I also mentioned the idea of the discomfort. So the author that I read talked about this theory of kind of a discomfort being produced in societies where monotheism, the revolution of monotheism comes in. Now, from our standpoint, this is a healthy sort of a disruption, because ultimately it's not a disruption, it's continuity. This is sort of the thread that's going to, again, link that human drama to the divine drama. This is going to take us back to that time immemorial of Alastu bi Rabbikum, when all of Bani Adam testified to the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But what I wanted to actually mention here was to give you a definition of Tawheed that I think would be helpful in understanding why is it so difficult for these various communities to whom prophets and messengers are sent to accept that prophet or messenger. Why do they raise all these objections? Why are they so intransigent? Why do they kind of mock the prophet and messenger? Why do they seem determined to make that prophet or messenger's life as miserable as possible? Right? It's because they are kind of reacting on a very visceral level to the idea of Tawheed. So we know literally Tawheed means what? There are different definitions out there. Unicity, unity, asserting oneness. But this is what it really is in an applied sense. It is belief in the wahdaniyah, the oneness of God. It is the assertion that Allah is one in His being, without partner, unique without peer, ultimate without equal. It's the declaration that there is no deity but Allah. It is belief in Allah's transcendence, that tanzih. And that is to say that Allah does not resemble anything. وَلَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ, right? That Allah does not resemble anything that exists, nor does anything that exists resemble Him. Now, I want us to understand something here. that Tawheed, and the author makes a really interesting point about, is it difficult or easy to conceptualize? For some people, it comes very easy. For some people, it's a process. There is some difficulty there. Because in the utterance of La ilaha illallah is something that the nafs, the lower self, does not like, because there's a negation. It begins with a negation. We actually are forced to negate the existence of any deity, of any, that we're saying there is no being that is worthy of worship except Allah Ta'ala. The nafs does not like this. Because again, there's that tendency to kind of aggrandize and arrogate to ourselves certain abilities. So the idea really behind Tawheed and sort of reading human history in terms of Tawheed is that ultimately Tawheed is going to serve to demonstrate for us our rootedness as the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to remind us of those primordial origins, to remind us that our ultimate destination is always back to Allah ta'ala. And the statement of La ilaha illallah carries with it weighty implications. And least we dismiss the people of Sayyidina Nuh or Sayyidina Musa as being unintelligent, we have to understand there's a certain level of intelligence and operation there, at least cognitively, that perhaps some of them really understood the weightiness, the weighty implications of La ilaha illallah. It means the very dethroning of Pharaoh himself. Of course they're going to push back when the prophet comes with this particular message. And the author made a really interesting observation. He said, when you look at paganism and monotheism, he said, for paganism, polytheism, it's easy. That's why the nafs is kind of gravitating towards that, right? There's not a lot of work those people have to do when they kind of construct those different deities and bow down to them. But monotheism, a commitment to Tawheed, it requires a lot cognitively, mentally, psychologically, spiritually, emotionally of the human being. So again, why these various communities really push back against their prophets and messengers. So let's look at the two prophets side by side now. So Sayyidina Nuh is going to spend, as we said several times, almost a millennium with his people, is the kind of majority interpretation of that. Whereas Sayyidina Musa, his lifespan is more akin to what we would recognize, right? About 80 years or so is when he passes away. Sayyidina Nuh, from my reading of it, is not really an outsider spending all that time with his people. He's from amongst them. Whereas Sayyidina Musa is the quintessential outsider. And that's why his story is so remarkable. He is the son of the Hebrews, of Bani Israel, being raised in the palace of Fir'aun. Now, the followers are different in the sense that while Bani Israel are enslaved, so obviously it is those weak and marginalized people that are following Sayyidina Musa because those are his people, he also attracts members of the elite, and we see that. Whether it is the Islam, whether it is the belief of Asiyah bint Muzahim, the wife of Pharaoh, whether it is other believers in Pharaoh's household, there were a few of them, whether it's the magicians, he actually attracts those people to his message. Then there are the family members, right? By and large, the family members of Sayyidina Musa to whom we're introduced are believers, whereas for Sayyidina Nuh, that's not quite the same experience there. Both prophets and messengers, of course, are going to exhibit a great deal of sabr. That's why they're called ulul azam min al-rusul, that patience. So we see patience, we see perseverance, then we see that moment of deliverance. So in terms of narrative structure, the stories are marvelous. Then there's the metaphor of the water in both examples. So the deluge that is going to at least engulf the area that Sayyidina Nuh and his people lived, right? Versus Sayyidina Musa and of course traversing and the parting of the Red Sea. And finally, things being preserved. So the Quran actually mentions the ark being preserved as a sign for us, and Fir'aun being preserved as a sign, his body being preserved, and I think there are actually some discoveries that have corroborated that. So now, Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam. How many times do we read about him in the Quran? Many, many times. Of course, we know this is a fact that's oft repeated, but it's worth mentioning again that his story recurs the most frequently in the Quran, because you have to understand that the very first, I want to say reader, but the Prophet peace upon him, was unlettered. He's ma'ana biqari when the angel comes to him. So the very first reciter of that Quran and teacher of that Quran is the Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He is reciting it, reflecting upon it. So that's why there is so much about Sayyidina Musa, because the parallels between those two prophets are remarkable. Not to mention the idea of prophecy, i.e. predictions, that a prophet will be raised up in latter history who will resemble Sayyidina Musa, and of course we know that Sayyidina Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. Now lineage, I thought this was really interesting. So, you know, we get a sense of, sorry brother, I'm just gonna go this way. We get a sense of some of the family tree, right? So I had a question that came to me the other day about women in the Quran and why don't we know more about kind of female relatives and why aren't they named, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, someone actually mentioned to me very helpfully, what do we actually know about the father of Sayyidina Musa, right? The Quran is silent when it comes to that discussion. We do know a lot more about the women folk in the family, and specifically the mother and the sister of Sayyidina Musa alayhim as-salam, and of course his brother Harun. So to me that's very intriguing that even though the women are not named, we have to obviously go to other sources, the tafasir, sometimes the hadith, sometimes kind of the kind of pre-Islamic sources to actually see what are the names of the people kind of around the prophets or messengers. But I think about وَرَبَطْنَا عَلَى قَلْبِهَا. It's a really beautiful description in Al-Qasas, by the way. If you really want a sort of really almost full-length narrative of the story of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam, go to chapter 28 and you're going to read really from the beginning of that surah. Much of that surah is really about the experience of Sayyidina Musa and his mother. So what is the context, right? There are a number of references in the Quran to what's happening at that time, a very, very difficult time for the children of Israel. Now keep in mind, it was not always like this for them in Egypt. In the time of Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, they enjoyed a rank of some prestige in Egypt. That's going to change by the time we get to the, I think it's the 19th dynasty of Ramses II. The children of Israel, right, the Jewish community, they are enslaved. So Sayyidina Musa is the son of Amran or Amram, and Jochebed or Yechawand is what I found for the name of his mother. Right, but again, she's not named in the Quran, but we know about her actions. We know that Allah Ta'ala inspires her to place Musa in that basket and to place the basket in the river, which is nothing that would kind of be kind of intuitive for a mother to do. But the context is that Fir'aun has this dream that he is going to be destroyed by one of the children of Bani Israel, one of the males of Bani Israel. So that's why he orders his soldiers, and the Quran tells us this, that this is one of the great trials that Bani Israel that they experience. That Fir'aun, that there's an order that they are going to kill the infant males and they're going to spare the women. And there's a lot we can understand from this story, right? One, obviously, it is this fear of Fir'aun that he will be put to an end by one of those children. But also, I think it tells us something about the status of women in that society, right? And what they were kind of used for, and what they were kind of seen, what role they were seen as kind of filling, in the sense that those women were spared, but they're slaughtering the infant sons. So what happens is that Harun and they alternate years, by the way. So Sayyidina Harun, Aaron is born in the year that they're sparing those children, but Musa alayhi salam is born in a year when they've been ordered to go and find the infant males and to kill them. So his mother, to save his life, she receives inspiration from Allah Ta'ala, and that's why there's an important minority opinion amongst the ulama that women can also be prophets in the sense of receiving inspiration from Allah Ta'ala. So she receives inspiration, he's placed in that basket. And again, this is where just the amazing kind of highs and lows of this story. So we have, again, this baby that's born into what is a slave class, where the boys are being killed before they can even probably reach the first 2 to 3 years of life. And he ends up being spared by none other than the wife of Pharaoh himself. And I just love the irony in this story. And what Fir'aun must have been thinking when his wife comes to him and suggests they actually raise this child as one of their own. It's really remarkable. And this is all happening, again, in this context of, it's a deeply stratified society. You've got Fir'aun, and you have his advisors, and Haman, and you have the elite. And then you have, of course, the Hebrews or the Israelites who are enslaved. So it really kind of begs the question, right? Is Fir'aun wondering just a little bit what's going to kind of sort of come of the situation when he brings this child into his household? So here's the ayah, if you all can see this. Let's see, I think it's this ayah right here. I love this ayah. Again, this is chapter 28. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. فَالْتَقَطَهُ آلُ فِرْعَوْنَ لِيَكُونَ لَهُمْ عَدُوًّا وَحَزَنًا. This is really remarkable. And the family of Fir'aun picked him up so that he would become to them an enemy and a cause of grief. إِنَّ فِرْعَوْنَ وَهَامَانَ وَجُنُودَهُمَا كَانُوا خَاطِئِينَ. Verily, Pharaoh and Haman and their soldiers were deliberate sinners. So you can kind of imagine, right? You've got Asya, who's raising Musa alayhi salam. You have the mother who's been reunited. This is a scenario. The mother comes back because the sister observes where the basket goes. She sees the basket being picked up. She approaches Asya and the courtiers and says, I know someone who can come and nurse this child. She brings in the very mother of Musa as his wet nurse. Right, you all are familiar with the outlines of that story. So here we have mother and child being reunited, and this child is growing up in the lap of luxury in the household in the palace of Fir'aun. Right, and you can kind of, just to kind of be a fly on the wall, right, at that time, and to kind of observe what was that dynamic between Fir'aun and Asya and Musa, to actually have observed that. So, and you can almost kind of reading between the lines, because this is what the Quran invites us to do, right? There is what's obviously stated here in the ayah, but also trying to figure out that emotional world that's being inhabited right now. As Fir'aun, on the one hand, perhaps indulges his wife's fondness for the child, but also looks askance at this young Israelite who's come into his palace, wondering what's going to become of all of them. Now, and Allah Ta'ala tells us, all right, so now what happens? It gets to a certain point where now Musa alayhi salam is a young man. He's become strong and vigorous. He's come into his own. And now, again, that position as outsider is going to be kind of highlighted by this incident that happens. Because up until this point, he has enjoyed the privileges of being in the palace of Ramses II, who, by the way, apparently did a lot of building in Egypt. Was phenomenally wealthy, and so it was a very easy life that he enjoys up until a point, because what happens is that he is out and about and he encounters, as the Quran tells us, he encounters basically a confrontation between an Egyptian, and he knows, of course, that he's not an Egyptian. He knows who he is. He understands his origins, and one of his own people. So we know that in an effort to defend his kinsman from the Egyptian, he accidentally kills the Egyptian. And then what happens is that he comes back and he finds the same person from Bani Israel again embroiled in another dispute. And now he realizes that he's erred, that this person probably instigated it. So then what happens is that he's going to be warned. Okay, this is Midian. So I don't have all the ayat here. Inshallah, you can look them up. But what happens is that a believing member of Fir'aun's household comes to him and warns him and tells him the people are assembling a council, and they're going to determine what to do with you, and you need to leave because they are plotting against you. So at this point, look at that sort of that again, he goes from slave class to lap of luxury to now being this person that is hunted and exiled from Egypt. And literally he leaves with just the clothing on his back, doesn't take anything with him, he can't. He's running for his life. And now Sayyidina Musa is going to feel that loneliness and that isolation that are going to be the result of this exile. And he goes to Midian, a place the Quran mentions. It's probably somewhere, I would say probably somewhere in the northwestern Arabian Peninsula. And we know he's going to now encounter what are going to be some of the early kind of Arab tribes. And specifically, he encounters Shu'aib, the family of the Prophet Shu'aib alayhi salam. And I want you to get a sense of this. He is frightened. He's exhausted. He has no reserves left. He doesn't have a penny on him, not a dirham or a dinar. He's an outcast. He knows that the Egyptians, if he appears again, they're going to kill him. He knows that his people can't come to his aid, and some of them he can't trust. What does he do at this point? So he finds himself in Midian. And I just can't imagine being in his shoes and what he must be feeling at this point in his life. So now I want to give us this little vignette from the story of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam, beautifully illustrated in the Quran. Again, this is still chapter 28. So the scenario is that he encounters a group of people. Again, you all know the story, so I'm not going to repeat it verbatim, but I'm going to highlight these themes here that are important for us. So he's in this, it really is a space of like ultimate ubudiyya. I mean, this is all about really kind of realizing that slavehood to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, I think about the definition of Allah ta'ala that we see in books of theology, that where theologians are going to say that Allah ta'ala is the one that is in need of no one or nothing other but whom all else are in absolute need of. All right, the one whom everyone that we're in absolute need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you see that in this moment. And we would again interpret it in worldly terms. We would look at this as this is a fall from grace. Look at what he could have had if he had just stayed in the palace of Fir'aun, become one of his kind of devoted aides, had not rocked the boat, had not kind of intervened in the situation with the Israelite and the Egyptian. What if Musa had just kind of remained quiet and complacent, but that was not in his nature. So he flees to Midian, and the scenario is he finds this group of people, and they're at a watering hole, and there are some trees, and it's kind of an oasis, and they're watering their flocks. And that's when he is going to notice that there are going to be two women that are kind of hanging back. So let's look at the ayah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. ولما ورد ماء مدين وجد عليه أمة من الناس يسقون ووجد من دونهم امرأتين تذودان قال ما خطبكما قالتا لا نسقي حتى يصدر الرعاء وأبونا شيخ كبير. It's a beautiful ayah. So here, this is a scenario. So he comes to the wells of Midian. He finds people that are watering their flocks. Then he finds that there are two women who are kind of hanging back. Right? And he asks them why they are hanging back, and they said, we do not water until the shepherds go because of their shyness, their modesty, and they explain our father is an elderly man. Now, I don't have all the ayahs for you, but I wanted to kind of focus just on his response, because I just love what the Quran is telling us about kind of gender interaction in this particular moment. Because we know that Musa alayhi salam, again, kind of, he's sizing up the situation, by the way. Okay, he's not oblivious to who's around him. He's kind of sizing things up. They're kind of sizing him up, but they're of course doing this with a lot of adab, with a lot of decorum. So فَسَقَى لَهُمَا ثُمَّ تَوَلَّى إِلَى الظِّلِّ فَقَالَ رَبِّ إِنِّي لِمَا أَنزَلْتَ إِلَيَّ مِنْ خَيْرٍ فَقِيرٍ. So he's very direct here. He sees that they need help. All right, he just offers them help and then he goes back. He doesn't engage in any kind of additional conversation, neither do they. So he helps them, then he goes back to the shade of a tree that he finds, and then this is when he utters one of the most beautiful supplications in the Quran. And I really love prophetic supplications because they really, they really kind of exemplify what it actually means to be a servant of Allah Ta'ala and the language to use with Allah Ta'ala. It's not, note the language is always very gentle. It's always very, it's gentle. It is a language that at its very heart always assumes husn al-dhan billahi ta'ala, always thinking well of God. And that is such an important theological position to take, to think well of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, despite these circumstances, by the way, which are very difficult. Because think about it, the women very easily could have sized him up and decided not to say anything to their father about him. They could have left him to their own devices. He didn't have anything, right? At this point, he has absolutely nothing to show to them. So he makes this dua. And in this dua, it's my Lord, indeed I am for whatever good you would send down to me in need, right? إِنِّي لِمَا أَنزَلْتَ إِلَيَّ مِنْ خَيْرٍ فَقِيرٍ. So he describes himself as faqir, as in need of Allah Ta'ala, in need of that khair, whatever that khair is. Note, by the way, the term khair is nakira here. It's an indefinite noun, not a definite noun. And one of the things that's really important here, the reason why this is in the indefinite is because at this point, Sayyidina Musa, that his heart is receptive to whatever Allah Ta'ala is going to send him. And this is a dua that we can replicate in our own lives. Because sometimes, again, we as human beings, we think that we know what's best for us. I.e., we'll actually kind of negotiate with Allah Ta'ala. I want this blessing, and I don't really want that thing to happen, and I want my blessing to look like this and come in that form and happen on this timeline. We do it all the time, whether we realize it or not. But here, Sayyidina Musa is saying whatever form that khair comes in, that's what he needs, that's what he will welcome and accept from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the women, by the way, overhear him, right? He says this dua, and they are within hearing, within earshot of this. So one of the things that the Mufassirin actually say about the dua is that when he says this dua, really his hope is just for a morsel of food at this point. That's what he wants. As long as they can bring him something to eat, because they mentioned that by this point, even though, of course, Musa is very, very strong constitution, very robust, very strong, but at this point, the commentators say he's so emaciated you can even kind of like see, almost kind of like see his ribs or something. Like he's in bad shape. So he just wants at this point just a morsel of food. And look at what he receives in return. And how are we doing on time, by the way?
10 minutes, go all the way to 6:45, you're good.
Okay. So, so at this point, we know what happens. Not only do they come back with a promise of a meal, but in fact, we know what happens. They go to their father, and they tell their father that the best person that you could bring, that you could kind of hire to help you, and they tell him the whole story, and they say that the best person you could bring is the person who is strong, the person who is trustworthy. Again, they are reading the situation very well. And least we think it's just some young woman who's become enamored of this handsome young man. We have to understand that this is an example of Allah Ta'ala really choosing for and sending to a prophet a spouse that will be able to support that prophet and messenger in their vocation. This is very important because not every prophet or messenger is going to have that experience. We know, for example, Sayyidina Nuh and Sayyidina Lut, they don't have that experience necessarily in their household. But this is a very intelligent young woman that is going to become the wife of Sayyidina Musa. And of course, her father, right, is also understanding in that situation what's happening. That she sees something in Sayyidina Musa which is commendable, which she admires. So we know what happens. She goes back in a very kind of demure way, invites him. One of the things that happens is that as they kind of go back to her father's house, I think he actually walks in front of her just to kind of, because he's gallant, right? He knows to walk behind her is going to make her uncomfortable. It's just a really remarkable story of how their lives intersect. So what happens is that the father or the father-in-law is going to offer a job to Sayyidina Musa. So here again, look at that change in fortune. He recites that dua, and now he has a wife that's being promised to him. He has a home. He has for his father-in-law none other than Prophet Shu'aib alayhi salam, and he has a commitment, he has a contract of 8 to 10 years that he is going to fulfill. So this is the story of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam. Just some things I wanted to highlight for tonight to again reinforce this idea of loneliness and how prophets and messengers deal with it. And that in that moment when we would really kind of think that he is at his lowest, that moment that really is just a very kind of dark moment for him. A moment where, again, that language he uses, a moment where most of us, as ordinary human beings, would complain, would express our dislike of the situation, would maybe react with sadness or with anger or rail against fate, and wonder sort of what type of hand we've been dealt, it's really in those moments that those prophetic qualities and their ethical choices are really going to shine through, alayhim wassalam. So, inshallah, a couple more things I want to say, and then I think we're going to wrap up and see what questions we have. Something that I also wanted to share about Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam is the ahadith where he's mentioned. So he's mentioned, for example, in the context of Isra and Mi'raj, the miraculous night journey and ascent to heaven, for example, or the Prophet, peace be upon him, will often describe the kind of the features of Sayyidina Musa, and he'll make connections to people that the Sahaba might recognize. We also read about Sayyidina Musa in relation to the idea of the barzakh, or that intermediate realm between the world and the hereafter. And then another thing that we read about Sayyidina Musa in the hadith is this particular moment. And this is interesting because here in Sahih al-Bukhari, we get actually a description of what happens with Sayyidina Musa at the very end of his life. And by the way, I will pick back up tomorrow with a look at his relationship with Bani Israel, how they kind of relate to each other, how he engages with them, the choices that he makes, alayhi salam, the choices they make. And we're going to be looking at kind of what happens sort of after the passage through the Red Sea. And I want you to understand something here. Sayyidina Musa does end up kind of experiencing exile again when Bani Israel, when they have to wander in the desert for those 40 years. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. It's reported that it's during that time, that's actually how he and his brothers spend the last years of their lives. So like I said, there's a bit of open-endedness in this story, right? It doesn't really have a neat and tidy end. I mean, wandering for 40 years in the desert is probably not how we would want to conclude our story. But the accounts tell us that first Harun passes away, and then Sayyidina Musa, is going to pass away. And here's the hadith. So the angel of death was sent to Moses. And when he went to him, Moses slapped him so severely, it actually injured his eye. I mean, this is an angel, by the way. The angel went back to his Lord and said, you sent me to a servant who does not want to die. So Allah restored the eye of the angel and said, go back and tell him to place his hand over the back of an ox, for he will be allowed to live for a number of years equal to the number of hairs coming under his hand. So the angel came to him and told him the same. Then Moses asked, "O my Lord, what will be then?" He said, "Death will be then." And he said, "Let it be now." And he asked Allah that he bring him near the sacred land, because they were just outside of entering into the area of the Holy Land, of basically Bayt al-Maqdis. So he asked Allah that he bring him near the sacred land, at least that he could perceive it at a distance of a stone's throw. And Allah's Messenger said, alayhi salatu wasalam, were I there, I would show you, i.e. the Sahaba, the grave of Moses by the way near the red sand hill. So I wanted to kind of say a couple things about that account in Sahih al-Bukhari, and again reflect on the beautiful language of the prophets and messengers. And here's another ayah for you. And this is in Surah 26, is a Shu'ara. Yeah, I think it's Shu'ara. So this is it's Shu'ara. So this is chapter 26, thank you, verse 62, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. قَالَ كَلَّا إِنَّ مَعِيَ رَبِّ سَيَهْدِينَ. I really love this surah. There's so much about Sayyidina Ibrahim that's so beautiful in this surah as well, and so many other prophets and messengers. So, and by the way, this is really sort of a statement on the tongue of many prophets and messengers, especially when they are experiencing, again, those moments of loneliness and isolation. Again, when everything around them goes dark, there is still that light in front of them. And Musa said, "No, indeed, with me is my Lord, he will guide me." The context, by the way, right, again, here's a contrast between him and Sayyidina Nuh. Sayyidina Nuh only has a handful of followers, we know that. Sayyidina Musa brings a lot of people with him, and we're going to learn more about that tomorrow. Like in terms of the numbers, yes, Bani Israel, they've got the numbers, but they waver a lot, and it's this moment of the parting of the Red Sea, they waver, and this is when Musa says, "Verily, with me is my Lord, he will guide me." All right, last but not least, lessons we can extract from these particular episodes in the life of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam. Number one, I love his emotional transparency. You know, it's because we kind of think of prophets and messengers have to be kind of strong and stoic. He's very strong, but not always stoic, right? His emotions really kind of shine through, and I think that's really healthy. Again, ulul azm min ar-rusul, resoluteness. The fact that he goes back to Egypt, by the way, right, after everything that happens, that he gathers up his courage and goes back with Sayyidina Harun, and ultimately his belief in redemption, as we're going to see tomorrow, inshallah ta'ala. So that's what I have for you tonight. Jazakumullah khairah. I've really enjoyed interacting with everybody here, and inshallah, hope to spend more time, inshallah, in Knowledge Retreat tomorrow. I brought my kids with me, so inshallah, we're going to, inshallah, hopefully we'll be able to sit in the audience a little bit more tomorrow. But I think with that, we're going to go to Q&A, right?
Yeah.
Inshallah. Okay, thank you.